At 1955, on the night of February 22, 1943, Commander James Hirschfield stood on the bridge of the United States Coast Guard cutter Campbell while the cold North Atlantic swallowed every hint of light around them. His radar operator was tracking a moving contact at 4,600 yards, and the glow of the radar screen reflected across the faces of the men standing watch. Hirschfield was 40 years old with 2 decades of service behind him, and he had spent those years chasing rum runners during Prohibition, guiding patrol craft through storms and escorting convoys through the most dangerous waters on Earth. Yet despite all these years at sea, he had never sunk a single German submarine. 19 U-boat hunters were stalking Convoy 166, and by the time this battle ended, 14 merchant ships would vanish beneath the freezing waves. Campbell herself was a Treasury-class cutter, 327 feet long, capable of a maximum speed of 20.5 knots. She had been escorting convoys since December 1941, and her crew of 200 men had survived 2 relentless years of Atlantic combat. They had saved drowning sailors, dodged torpedoes, dropped depth charges on ghostly contacts that fled into the deep, yet none of their attacks had ever finished an enemy submarine. Hirschfield had joined the Coast Guard in 1922 as a young man eager for a life at sea. Now with war raging, the Coast Guard served under United States Navy authority, and Hirschfield found himself responsible for this sturdy cutter, while the Atlantic grew more violent every month. February of 1943 was the darkest period of the Battle of the Atlantic. 120 ships were destroyed across the world, 82 of those in the Atlantic alone. German Admiral Karl Donitz had unleashed more than 100 U-boats into the mid-ocean gap, that vast 600-mile stretch where Allied aircraft could not reach, and where wolf packs hunted almost without challenge. Convoy 0166 had departed Liverpool on February 11th, with 63 merchant vessels carrying vital supplies across the ocean. Campbell and her sister cutter Spencer led the escort, while 5 corvettes from Canada and Britain supported them. The Polish destroyer Berza joined them during the crossing, strengthening the defense. 8 escorts and 63 merchants were now facing 19 submarines determined to tear the convoy apart. For 8 days, the ships battled heavy northwesterly gales that scattered the formation and left isolated vessels vulnerable. On February 20th, U-604 sighted the convoy and called in the Wolfpack. The next day the destruction began. At dawn, U-332 launched a torpedo that struck the Norwegian freighter Stigst, sending her to the bottom with her cargo. Later the same day, U-92 attacked twice. The British Empire trader was hit at 8:32 in the evening, and 2 hours after that the Norwegian tanker NT Nielsen Alonso exploded in a burst of flame that painted the night sky. Campbell reached the burning wreckage, and Hirschfield ordered his ship into the rescue zone, even though the waters were alive with submarines. 50 Norwegian sailors were struggling in the water, which was only 36 degrees Fahrenheit, giving a survival time of perhaps 15 minutes. Campbell's crew pulled every one of them out alive, working with a speed and determination born from 2 years of practice. Hirschfield then directed his helmsman back toward the sinking Nielsen Alonso, because the captain of the tanker had not yet disposed of his confidential papers. Those documents needed to be recovered or destroyed. Campbell closed to within 1 mile of the ship when a torpedo wake shot across her stern, missing by only a few yards. The blast of the detonation threw walls of water over the cutter's deck. A U-boat had attacked them while they were trying to save survivors. Hirschfield ordered depth charges dropped and then brought his ship back toward the convoy. He had rescued 50 men even as flames from distant ships climbed into the night. Through the 21st and into the 22nd, Campbell hunted multiple contacts. She drove submarines deep with depth charges and forced at least 2 to withdraw due to damage. But every time Campbell chased one contact, another submarine struck a merchant vessel. Ships fell one after another, and sailors froze in the water while the Wolfpack continued its assault. 14 ships would be lost, and more than 200 merchant sailors would die in the freezing Atlantic. By evening on February 22nd, the Wolfpack still had the upper hand. At 19:55, Campbell's radar detected another surface contact at 4,600 yards. Hirschfield ordered full speed ahead. The target was moving. The sound operator picked it up at 2,400 yards, and the distance narrowed rapidly. At 1,700 yards, then 1,200. At 2019, a lookout finally spotted the enemy. A German submarine 350 yards off the starboard bow, running on the surface, struggling to escape. She had already been battered by depth charges from Burza. This wounded submarine was U-606, a Type 8 C-boat, with a crew of 45 men, commanded by Oberleutnant Xerxes Wolfgang Heinrich. She had already sunk 3 ships from the convoy: the British Empire Redshank, the American Chattanooga City, and the American Expositor, and now she was trying to flee on failing diesel engines. Hirschfield had seconds to choose his move. He could follow standard procedure fire, weapons, drop depth charges, maintain distance, or he could take a risk so extreme that few commanders would even consider it. He chose the unthinkable: ram her. His order was clear. Full right rudder. Campbell swung sharply toward the target while crewmen braced themselves. U-606 tried to evade, but she had only 18 seconds before impact. Campbell rushed toward her at 18 knots, her bow wave rising in white curls. At 300 yards, then 200, then 150, the gun crews opened fire. 20mm cannons and 3-inch 50 caliber guns unleashed a storm of steel at the enemy vessel. Gunfire from Campbell ripped across the dark waves as shells hammered. The exposed submarine and sparks burst from her conning tower in sharp flashes of orange and white. The violence of metal striking metal echoed through the night and rolled across Campbell's starboard side. Among the guns that opened fire was Gun 4, the 3-inch 50 caliber weapon, whose entire crew consisted of black sailors led by Chief Steward Lewis Etheridge. Etheridge stood as gun captain with Pointer Raymond, not controlling elevation, while 9 mess attendants worked as loaders and handlers. For 2 long years, these men had drilled without ever firing their weapon in true combat. And now, at last, their training met the moment they had waited for. Shell after shell roared from the barrel and streaked through the air until 32 rounds had been fired along with continuous bursts from the 20mm guns. The night lit with tracer arcs, and the German sailors on U-606 could only watch helplessly. Some of them scrambled onto the deck, preparing to abandon their submarine as they realized there was no hope of fighting back. None attempted to man the deck gun. They knew the fight was already lost. At 2021, Campbell struck the U-boat along her starboard side in a glancing collision that shook both vessels. The force of the impact threw men to the deck and sent equipment sliding. Campbell's hull scraped along the steel skin of the submarine, and the sound of grinding metal screeched through the darkness. Then disaster struck for Campbell. As the vessels passed one another, the bow-diving plane of U-606 sliced into Campbell's hull like a blade. It tore open a gash 15 feet long and 8 inches wide, about 3 feet below the waterline, cutting straight into her engine room. In an instant, seawater exploded into the compartment under enormous pressure. The frigid Atlantic surged inside flooding machinery spaces, knocking men off balance and filling the room with the roar of water crashing against steel. The generators sputtered and failed. Electrical systems shorted out. Campbell fell dark, silent, and powerless. Even as the 2 ships separated, Campbell's crew released 2 depth charges set for shallow detonation. The 600-pound Mark 7 charges struck the water, sank for a moment, and then detonated beneath the crippled submarine. The explosion lifted U-606 nearly 4 feet out of the sea, and for 3 brief seconds her hull hung above the surface, illuminated by the blast. Then she dropped back down, groaning under the force and settling heavily as more water poured into her damaged interior. The submarine was dead in the water. Her stern sank lower and her crew scrambled in chaos. Some leaped into the sea, trusting the icy water to offer a chance at life. Others remained on the conning tower, awaiting capture or rescue if any came. Campbell drifted past powerless and wounded. Water poured through the torn plating into her engine room. The situation was catastrophic. The flooding was so rapid that the engine room crew abandoned their stations and climbed to higher levels as water rose past their knees and then their waists. Steam hissed, machinery groaned. The stern of Campbell grew heavier as water filled the space. On the bridge commander, Hirschfield was struck by fragments of metal. No one knew whether the fragments came from Campbell's own guns, from small arms fire from the submarine, or from flying shrapnel during the collision. A piece sliced near his left ear, and another cut his eyelid, sending blood down his cheek. Still, he remained at his post, refusing to step aside at the moment when his ship needed him most. Damage control teams rushed to action under the direction of Commander Kenneth Coward. They needed to seal the breach halt, the flooding, and restore what little stability they could. But the wound in the hull was deep below the waterline. The ship had lost power. The sea around them was filled with hunters. 19 German submarines still roamed nearby. Campbell was half blind, half crippled, and moments away from sinking. Meanwhile, U-606 was sinking even faster. Her crew splashed in the black water, crying out in German as the cold seized their bodies within minutes. Campbell was too damaged to maneuver. She could not turn to collect survivors. Many of the Germans died within reach of salvation, falling silent as the North Atlantic claimed them. Only a few who drifted close enough were pulled up by Campbell's remaining crew. Among the dead was the submarine's commander Oberleut, Nunzer C. Wolfgang Heinrich, who had been blown from the conning tower by Campbell's barrage. At 20:35, Campbell lowered her motor launch. Lieutenant Arthur Pfeiffer commanded the small boat with 6 volunteers beside him. Their mission was simple yet dangerous: reach the crippled submarine, secure prisoners, and if possible capture the U-boat before she disappeared. When they reached U-606, around 2100, they found several surviving crew members standing on the conning tower, drinking from bottles of rum and champagne taken from the officer stores. Knowing their fate was sealed, they had opened the liquor rather than let it sink. 5 German sailors climbed down and were taken aboard the launch, including 1 officer and 4 enlisted men. They were shivering, exhausted, and acutely aware of how narrowly they had escaped death. Their voices trembled as they answered in broken English when spoken to. Even as the rescue occurred, the screams of more sailors drifting in the darkness reached Campbell. Many slipped beneath the water before help could reach them. Hypothermia seized them within minutes. The ocean showed no mercy. When the Polish destroyer Börse returned after pursuing another contact, she hauled 7 additional Germans from the submarine's conning tower. These were the last survivors. In total 12 men lived out of a crew of 47. The submarine sank shortly after midnight, sliding beneath the waves and vanishing into the deep 2,200 feet below. The first U-boat ever sunk by ramming during the Battle of the Atlantic, and the first U-boat kill credited to a United States Coast Guard cutter. But Campbell herself was now fighting for life. She was flooding heavily without power, exposed to enemy attack, and drifting in an ocean filled with danger. The men aboard her had saved others. Now they had to save their own ship with only determination, courage, and whatever strength remained in them. The body of Oberleut, Nunzer C. Wolfgang Heinrich, never resurfaced. A 3-inch shell had torn him from the conning tower and hurled him into the freezing black water, where the Atlantic swallowed him without a trace. With their commander dead, the remaining crew of U-606 fell into confusion. The warrant quartermaster panicked, and believing that staying aboard would mean certain death, he ordered the men to abandon the submarine at once. His fear doomed his own crew. The barrage had stopped, yet the men who followed his order jumped into waters that killed within minutes. The North Atlantic in February offered no mercy. Out of a crew of 47, only 12 survived. 37 men died either from exposure drowning or wounds inflicted during the battle. When the Polish destroyer Börse arrived around 21:30, She circled both crippled vessels, searching for more submarines, while also rescuing those who still clung to the hull of the dying U-boat. Berza had been pursuing another fleeting contact when she heard Campbell's radio calls and turned back. Her crew retrieved 7 German sailors from the conning tower men who had ignored the desperate order to abandon ship, and who thereby secured their only chance of living. 5 more had already been taken by Campbell's motor launch, 12 prisoners in total. The submarine slipped beneath the surface just after midnight, leaving behind only bubbles that broke on the waves and quickly vanished. U-606 now rested 2,200 feet down, sealed forever in the cold silence of the Atlantic. She was the first U-boat destroyed by ramming during the Battle of the Atlantic, and the first submarine kill for a United States Coast Guard cutter in the entire war. But Campbell was now paying the price for her victory. The engine room was completely flooded. Water 3 feet deep filled the entire compartment and continued to rise. Every pump on the ship whirred at full force. Men formed bucket lines, desperate to slow the rising sea. They passed buckets up ladders to the deck, threw water overboard, and repeated the motion in a rhythm of exhaustion and urgency. Yet their efforts alone could not defeat the ocean. Commander Kenneth Coward took charge of damage control parties and moved them with precision. They attempted to patch the hull from inside, but the gash was too large and the pressure of the sea far too strong. The wound was 15 feet long, 8 inches wide, and 3 feet underwater. The men could not reach it from within. They needed to cover it from the outside using a collision mat, a heavy canvas sheet reinforced with thick rope, and weighted so it could be hauled under the hull and positioned over the opening. They began this desperate task around 2035, working in total darkness because Campbell had lost all power. Without floodlights, the crew relied on their hands and faint lanterns that gave barely enough illumination to see faces or lines. The cutter rolled in the heavy swell, and each roll threatened to undo their work. Lines tangled, broke, and had to be reset. The men struggled against the sea for 3 relentless hours while the flooding continued. By 200 hours, they managed to secure the mat, and though it did not stop the flow entirely, it slowed it enough for pumps to nearly keep pace. Campbell settled but stopped sinking. She hovered on the edge of survival. Inside the bridge commander, Hirschfield refused all medical attention. Blood had dried along the side of his face where metal fragments had cut near his left ear and sliced his eyelid. Still, he remained at his station, watching each desperate effort and guiding the crew. His presence anchored the men. None doubted that he would stay with the ship until the end, whether that end came soon or after they reached port. At 300 hours, Berza came alongside in the darkness. The Polish destroyer prepared to evacuate most of Campbell's crew because the crippled cutter could not survive another encounter with a submarine. She could not shoot. She could not maneuver. She could barely float. The convoy needed escorts, and Berza could not remain forever guarding a sinking ship. Essential personnel only would stay aboard to maintain pumps and watch over damage control. The rest were ordered to transfer to Berza. 120 men crossed over in a steady flow along with the 50 Norwegian survivors Campbell had rescued earlier. Berza's decks became crowded shoulder to shoulder, but every man found space. Before the final count, a single exception was made. Campbell's mascot Sinbad the dog remained aboard. Sinbad had served with the cutter since 1937, had an official service record, and wore dog tags. The men believed he carried luck with him, and the thought of leaving him behind was unthinkable. Whether superstition or morale, the presence of the dog meant something. Hirschfield allowed him to stay. When the evacuations ended 73, men remained aboard Campbell along with their 4-legged shipmate. These were the men who would fight to keep the ship alive. The sea rolled beneath them, and the night carried a biting wind. Dawn was still hours away. Hidden somewhere beyond the darkness prowled other submarines, still hunting and still dangerous. The collision mat held but leaked. Pumps strained. bucket brigades worked without pause. The men rotated in shifts, 4 hours working, 4 hours resting in damp clothes with salt stinging their eyes. None truly slept. The air smelled of oil, seawater, sweat, and determination. Campbell drifted without power, unable to point her bow toward safety. Yet she survived the night, and when dawn finally broke at 06:30, grey light revealed a battered ship still floating against all odds. The German threat had not vanished. The sea had not grown kinder. But Campbell and her 73 remaining men had endured the hours most likely to kill them. Ahead lay an uncertain journey, one that would test every ounce of will they possessed, and one that was only beginning. Dawn crept slowly across the Atlantic at 06:30 on February 23rd, revealing a wounded cutter drifting helplessly in the grey morning light. Campbell floated low in the water, her stern weighted down by the flooded engine room, while her crew continued their endless struggle against the sea. The collision mat held against the gash torn by the U-boat, yet seawater still pushed through at a steady, sluggish flow that demanded constant attention. Pumps rumbled without pause, and bucket brigades passed water upward in a rhythm that had become second nature. 4 hours working, 4 hours resting, though rest was never more than brief, uneasy moments on cold steel. No one slept properly. The entire ship felt heavy with fatigue, but no one stopped. The Polish destroyer Berza circled watchfully, her sonar sending out pulses as she searched for submarines. 3 U-boats were still thought to be operating in the area: U-604, U-628, and U-186, and any one of them could appear without warning. A crippled cutter without power would be an easy victory for them. At 0800, Berza detected a contact and raced off, dropping depth charges into the deep. The sea erupted with white plumes, then quieted. There was no way to know whether the submarine had been destroyed, damaged, or merely fled into deeper water. Berza returned to Campbell's side, but she could not remain forever. Around noon, the Canadian corvette Dauphin arrived to assume escort duties. She was smaller than Berza, weighing roughly 950 tons, yet she carried operational sonar and working engines, which made her far more capable of guarding the drifting cutter. Berza steamed away to rejoin the convoy, leaving Campbell alone with Dauphin and the cold rolling sea. On the bridge commander, Hirschfield stood without flinching, though dried blood still clung to the cuts on his face. His eyelid was swollen. His left ear burned painfully where shrapnel had torn skin. His medical officer begged him repeatedly to let the wounds be cleaned and bandaged properly. Each time Hirschfield refused. He would accept treatment only when his ship reached port, if she reached port. For now he stayed at his post, watching the horizon, drinking thick black coffee brewed hours earlier. He estimated distances in his head. 800 miles to St. John's, Newfoundland, the nearest harbor capable of receiving the crippled cutter. At a towing speed of 4 knots, it would take possibly 8 days, maybe 10, perhaps even 2 full weeks if storms rolled in. Campbell's pumps would need to run all that time. They had the portable gasoline pumps, but no one knew how long they would hold out. Below deck, a damage control team rigged several of those portable pumps in the engine room. They roared to life, expelling water with gritty determination. The seawater level stopped rising, though it did not fall. It stayed eerily constant at 3 feet deep, cold and heavy. The men down there rotated every half hour because the bitter chill inside the compartment gnawed at limbs and drained strength quickly. They worked without complaint, driven by the knowledge that if they slowed, the ship would die. The engine room glowed faintly from emergency lanterns, casting shadows across twisted pipes and soaked bulkheads. Up on deck, lookouts scanned the sea for periscopes or torpedo trails. The ocean stretched empty in all directions. Campbell drifted northeast, carried by currents, pushing her farther away from safety with each passing hour. Every mile of drift meant more hours of towing and more days that pumps would need to survive. The hours dragged by as February 23rd surrendered to night. Dauphin stayed close and no submarines appeared. The pumps kept pace with the leak, only just enough. The crew whispered that Sinbad the dog moved through the ship with uncanny calm. He visited the men in the engine room, pressed his head against their legs, then padded off to the galley where scraps of food always waited for him. He returned to the bridge from time to time, glancing at Hirschfield before curling up nearby. The men believed deeply that the dog brought luck to the cutter, and the fact that he remained so steady helped their own resolve. By 2200 hours, another ship approached, coasting into view from the dark horizon. It was the old four-stack destroyer, HMS Salisbury, now manned by Norwegian sailors fighting under the banner of the Free Norwegian Navy. Salisbury had been hunting submarines near the convoy when she received orders to reinforce Campbell's fragile escort. Her arrival increased their chances of survival, though Campbell herself remained helpless, unable to move or defend herself. February 24th arrived bleak and grey. The ocean rolled steadily beneath the wounded cutter. Dauphin and Salisbury formed a shield around her, hunting for any approaching threat. Yet no tow appeared. No storm eased its grip. Campbell continued to drift northeast away from Newfoundland, as if the sea were trying to pull her back into danger. Inside the ship, morale wavered but did not break. Hirschfield still refused treatment. Pumps still groaned. Bucket brigades still moved tirelessly. The crew watched Sinbad as if the dog were a living compass guiding their fate. At 1500 on February 25th, a burst of hope crackled through the emergency radio. The British ocean-going tug Tenacity was en route from St. John's and expected to arrive the following day. Tenacity was a powerful tug built for harsh seas and long hauls. If she reached them, Campbell might yet survive the journey home. The men received the news with a quiet sense of strength. They had endured 3 days already. They could endure 2 more. All they had to do was keep the ship alive until the tug arrived through the vast dark winter ocean that stretched 800 miles across the horizon. The message that the British tug Tenacity was racing toward them breathed a fragile sense of hope into Campbell's exhausted crew, yet hope alone could not hold a sinking ship afloat. The pumps kept rumbling with steady determination, and the collision mat continued to bulge inward under the relentless pressure of the Atlantic, yet it still held. By the morning of February 26th at 0900, a lookout finally spotted a thin line of smoke to the southeast, and every man who heard the shout felt a surge of renewed strength. Tenacity was nearing them after steaming 800 miles through waters infested with submarines. She was designed for exactly this kind of mission, built to tow crippled ships across oceans with engines that could drag vessels far larger than Campbell. But even Tenacity had never attempted a tow this dangerous. The tug closed in carefully, and at 1100 hours she was close enough for her crew to begin rigging the tow. Heavy steel cables were run from Tenacity's stern to Campbell's bow, and the process demanded 3 full hours of back-breaking work. The sea rose and fell in heavy swells that threatened to snap lines or crush hands as cables tightened and loosened. Men shouted over the roar of waves, while Campbell rolled helplessly with each surge. Twice the lines had to be reset after slipping free, but by 1400 hours the final connections were secured. Tenacity's engines roared and the tow lines stretched taut, sending a groaning shudder through Campbell's tortured frame. Slowly, so slowly, she began to move. Her bow turned toward the southwest, lifted by the pull of the tug, and for the first time since the collision Campbell had a clear path toward safety. The tug managed 4 knots at best, and in heavy seas even that speed was uncertain. 4 knots meant 200 hours of towing 8 days if all went well, and longer if weather or machinery failed. Inside Campbell, the pumps had been running constantly for 4 days. They would need to survive 8 more. The crew understood the scale of what lay ahead, yet none stepped back from their duty. The towing cable stood between life and death. If it snapped, Campbell would drift helplessly again and might be lost before assistance could return. Behind the 2 leading vessels, 2 British escorts took protective positions, one ahead and one behind, screening the tow against any submarines bold enough to attack. The main convoy had already reached North America and could no longer help. Now Campbell's survival depended entirely on tenacity, her escorts, and the 73 men who refused to abandon their ship. February 26th slipped into February 27th, and the tow continued. Campbell dragged heavily through the sea like a wounded animal refusing to fall. The flooded engine room pulled her stern downward, but she stayed afloat. The collision mat still bowed inward, but remained in place. Pumps kept the water level at a fragile equilibrium. Below-deck men worked in endless shifts, maintaining gasoline pumps and hand pumps and hauling jerry cans to refuel them without pause. The water in the engine room was still 3 feet deep, but it did not rise. Above deck commander, Hirschfield remained on the bridge night and day. His face had stiffened where blood had dried around the cuts near his ear and eyelid. He ate only when his executive officer forced food into his hand, and even then he ate standing while watching the heavy towline ahead of them. Each groan or creak of steel made his heart tighten, but the line held. In the engine room the air was thick with oil fumes and the chill of seawater. 4 men worked each hand pump 30 minutes on 30 minutes off, then back again. Their muscles ached, yet they did not complain. None dared stop. Campbell's life pulsed through those pumps. When the gasoline pumps sputtered from low-fuel crews hauled fresh jerry cans and refilled them in the dark, refusing to let the engines die. Sinbad, the dog, continued his quiet patrols through the ship. He would wander to the engine room, letting the men scratch his ears or stroke his back. Then he would trot off to the galley in search of scraps or climb to the bridge to sit near the captain. The crew watched him closely. If the dog seemed anxious, morale dipped. If he was calm, they felt steadier. And Sinbad remained calm throughout the long journey, as if he knew the ship still had strength left to give. On February 28th, the seas grew heavier and tenacity struggled to maintain 3 knots. Waves slammed against both ships and the towline strained under the force. Campbell felt the surge of each swell deep in her bones. Yet she held. The 2 escorts remained vigilant, scanning for submarines, though the wolf pack had long since moved on, seeking easier prey. By March 1st, 6 days after the ramming, Campbell was still afloat, still under tow, still fighting. Many sailors had been awake for more than 36 hours straight, sustained only by willpower and thick coffee. Others collapsed into momentary sleep, leaning against bulkheads or lying on deck whenever their bodies gave in. March 2nd arrived. They had traveled roughly 600 miles, leaving 200 miles still to go. The coast of Newfoundland lay ahead, though not yet visible. Inside the ship, the pumps were beginning to falter. Gaskets wept, seals hissed. The machinery had run without rest since the attack, and maintenance was almost impossible. But the crew coaxed every bit of life they could from the equipment. The collision mat still held, though each hour wore at its seams. The towline held, though the tug strained constantly. The battered cutter held, though the ocean never stopped trying to claim her. By dawn on March 3rd at 0600, the lookout shouted what everyone prayed for. Land. Newfoundland was faint on the horizon about 40 miles away. Relief rippled through the ship, though no one dared celebrate yet. By noon, the outline of the harbor entrance of St. John's became clear. The sea seemed to calm with each mile, though that may have been an illusion born of hope. At 1500 hours, 2 local tugs, Northwind and Shulamite, steamed out to assist. They approached with practiced skill, ready to guide one of the most battered ships ever to reach their port. As evening approached, the wounded cutter inched towards safety, pulled by tenacity, supported by the escorts, flanked by the harbor tugs. Every man on deck watched in silence as land drew near. Their battle since February 22nd had been unending, yet now the end of the ordeal finally stood before them. Campbell had traveled 800 miles under tow, with a hole torn in her hull. Against all odds, she was still alive. At 1500 hours on March 3rd, 2 additional tugs, Northwind and Shulamite, pushed out through the cold harbor mouth to meet the incoming vessels. Their engines rumbled as they approached the battle-scarred cutter that had defied the Atlantic for nearly 2 weeks. They moved into position with expert precision, ready to guide Campbell on the final stretch of her impossible journey. By 1700 hours on March 3, 1943, Campbell crossed into St. John's Harbor, pulled by tenacity, and steadied by the harbor tugs. The battered cutter moved slowly across the darkening water, surrounded by peaceful hills that formed a natural shield around the port. Commander Hirschfield remained on the bridge, still upright, still refusing medical treatment, still bearing the dried blood from the night of the ramming. He looked upon the harbor with quiet exhaustion. His ship had survived. His men had saved her. Below decks, Sinbad wagged his tail as if celebrating with the crew. Campbell rolled heavily as she approached the pier, and onlookers paused their work to stare at the sight. The cutter sat low in the water, especially aft. Rust streaks ran along her hull. Her stern seemed close to dipping beneath the surface. The gash in the hull was partly hidden under the waterline, yet visible enough to show how deep the wound ran. Yard workers began repairs early on March 4th, after hauling Campbell into dry dock. They drained the flooded engine room and climbed down to inspect the damage. What they discovered stunned even experienced shipwrights. The 15-foot wound was only the beginning. U-606 had struck with catastrophic force. Her steel bowplane had sliced through the plating, buckling internal frames and cracking structural supports. Several bulkheads had been twisted and panels bent inward by the pressure of the sea. Every generator, turbine, electrical cable, and valve in the engine room was ruined by salt water. Corrosion had already begun. Sludge coated the floor. Tools floated in shallow pools that smelled of oil and rust. The work ahead was monumental. The yard calculated that repairs would take at least 6 months, possibly longer. They would need to cut away damaged plating, replace structural frames, rebuild the generators, rewire entire circuits, and restore the engines from the ground up. Yet no one suggested scrapping the ship. Campbell had become a legend the moment she rammed U-606 and survived the ordeal that followed. The United States Coast Guard intended to return her to the war stronger than before. Only after the ship had been secured in dry dock did Commander Hirschfield finally allow doctors to treat him. They cleaned dried blood from his face and stitched the deeper gashes. He would carry faint scars near his ear and across his eyelid for the rest of his life, reminders of that violent night in February. He accepted the Purple Heart for his wounds and the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism. News of Campbell's victory spread across American newspapers by March 17th. Headlines celebrated the Coast Guard cutter that charged a submarine, sank it, and then survived an 800-mile tow after nearly being ripped apart. It was the first good news about the Atlantic campaign in weeks. The Battle of the Atlantic had been bleak through early 1943, with U-boats sinking ships faster than Allied shipyards could replace them. Campbell's story of survival, courage, and sacrifice offered inspiration at a time when it was desperately needed. Chief Steward Lewis Etheridge, the gun captain of Gun 4, did not receive recognition until 1952, 9 years later, when he was awarded the Bronze Star. He became the first African American in Coast Guard history to earn the decoration. The delay spoke to the inequalities of the era, yet did nothing to diminish the heroism he and his all-black gun crew displayed when they fired 32 3-inch rounds and drove the submarine into its final moments. Etheridge deserved the medal on February 22, 1943, but he finally received it with honor in 1952. Meanwhile, the shipyard continued its work through spring and summer. By July, Campbell stood renewed. Fresh plates reinforced her hull. Her engines were rebuilt. Electrical systems rewired. Her radar upgraded. Her anti-aircraft defenses improved. When she left dry dock, she was faster, stronger, and more capable than she had ever been. She returned to convoy escort service in August 1943, heading back into the North Atlantic, where U-boats still lurked, though now increasingly hunted instead of hunters. Campbell remained on duty through the remainder of the war. She saw service in the Mediterranean, and the storm swept northern waters and escorted merchant ships through choke points where submarines waited. She never rammed another submarine. She never needed to. By late 1943, Allied tactics, air cover, and technology began to turn the tide. U-boats were being sunk faster than Germany could produce them, and the dreaded wolf packs were slowly losing effectiveness. Campbell's ramming of U-606 became one of many blows contributing to the eventual collapse of the U-boat threat. Commander Hirschfield served with Campbell until December 1943, before being reassigned to shore duty to train new officers and pass on the hard lessons learned in battle. He never forgot the 73 men who kept Campbell afloat, nor did he forget the flood-dark hours when the cutter stood between survival and oblivion. He rose through the ranks in the years that followed, achieving the rank of Vice Admiral, and eventually serving as Assistant Commandant of the United States Coast Guard for 8 years. Hirschfield retired in 1962 and lived until 1993, 50 years after the ramming. And through all those decades, he remembered the courage of his crew, the shock of impact, the desperate fight to stop the flooding, and the long, slow tow that seemed endless. He spoke of Campbell as if she were alive because in his heart she was. A ship that refuses to die becomes more than steel and rivets. She becomes willpower shaped into form, and Campbell refused to die. Throughout his long life, Commander James Hirschfield always insisted that his crew deserved the praise for saving Campbell. He said he gave the orders, but they carried the burden, and they were the ones who kept the wounded cutter alive when all logic said she should have gone under. His humility was genuine, and yet every man who served with him knew that his steady leadership had guided them through the worst hours of their lives. Campbell remained in active service, and her story continued long after the Atlantic battle faded into history. She served for 46 years across multiple conflicts, becoming the longest-serving cutter in the history of the United States Coast Guard. Sailors called her the Queen of the Seas, not for size or speed, but because she never gave up. She refused to die in 1943, and that spirit carried through every mission she undertook. Among those who shaped her legend was Sinbad, the ship's dog, who served aboard Campbell until 1948. Sinbad had been adopted by the crew in 1937 and was given an official service record complete with a paw print signature. He slept in his own hammock, had a designated battle station near the guns, and lived the same routine as any sailor. Sinbad traveled wherever the ship went, ate what the crew ate, drank strong shipboard coffee, and participated in mischief whenever the opportunity presented itself. He was loved deeply, not only because he was a loyal companion, but because the men believed he brought them luck. That belief only strengthened after the night of February 22nd, 1943, when he remained aboard during the evacuation and stood on deck during the ramming as if he understood what was happening. Sinbad had his own share of trouble and earned a reputation as a bit of a rogue. During a survey mission in Greenland in 1940, he wandered off and chased sheep until several of them died from exhaustion. The locals demanded that he be put down, but the captain refused. Instead, Sinbad received a formal court-martial. He was declared guilty of conduct unbecoming a member of Campbell's crew and demoted from first-class dog to seaman pup. He was also banned from ever returning to Greenland. The crew found the entire event hilarious, and Sinbad seemed unaffected by the punishment. 3 years later, during operations near Sicily, he went ashore and failed to return before departure. The military police eventually located him and sent him back to Campbell on a destroyer. He faced another court-martial, and the ruling forbade him from shore leave in foreign ports. Even with these restrictions, Sinbad remained a beloved figure aboard the cutter. He stood watch during general quarters, visited the men during long patrols, and lay beside wounded sailors when they needed comfort. The crew believed he helped keep morale high, and in the darkest hours of the Atlantic War, morale often meant survival. When he retired in September 1948, he was transferred to Barnegat Light Station in New Jersey, where he lived out the rest of his days. He wore his medals proudly, including the American Defense Service Medal, the American Campaign Medal, the European African Middle Eastern Campaign Medal, the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal, and the World War II Victory Medal, along with the Navy Occupation Service Medal. He possessed more decorations than many human sailors. Sinbad died on December 30th, 1951, at the age of 14. He was buried with military honors at Barnegat Light, his grave marked by a granite stone at the base of the flagpole. In the mess deck of the modern Campbell, a statue of Sinbad stands with a bone balanced on his nose. Tradition holds that anyone below the rank of chief who touches the statue will bring bad luck upon the ship. The superstitions of the sea never truly fade. While Campbell lived on U-606, remained at the bottom of the Atlantic, resting in 2,200 feet of cold, silent water at roughly 51 degrees north and 42 degrees west. The submarine had carried a crew of 47. 37 of them died, most from exposure in the freezing sea. Oberleutnant Sir C. Wolfgang Heinrich, who was only 30 years old, had taken command of the submarine in November 1942, just 3 months before Campbell found her. In that short span, he had sunk the Norwegian tanker N.T. Nielsen Alonso, the British Empire Redshank, the American Chattanooga City, and the American Expositor, and had damaged 2 other ships. Yet his success ended when Bürzer forced him to surface, and Campbell finished the job. Heinrich never rose to become one of Germany's famed U-boat aces. He never earned the Knight's Cross. His career ended in a single moment when a shell burst tore him from the conning tower and cast him into the North Atlantic. The 12 survivors of U-606 spent the remainder of the war in prisoner of war camps, first in Canada, then in the United States. They were released in 1946 and returned to Germany. Few ever spoke of the sinking or the horrors of that night. They had served their nation, experienced defeat, and survived when so many others did not, and they carried the weight of that memory in silence. February 1943 marked one of the most desperate periods of the Battle of the Atlantic. 120 ships were lost worldwide, with 82 lost in the Atlantic alone. Churchill later wrote that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat threat. March grew even worse. 43 U-boats attacked convoys SC-122 and HX-229 at the same time, and 22 merchant ships were destroyed in just 5 days. It appeared as if Germany might succeed in choking off Britain's lifeline. Yet a turning point was coming. In May 1943, later known as Black May, the Allies sank 43 U-boats, nearly a quarter of Germany's operational submarine force, in a single month. Advances in radar escort, carriers' long-range patrol aircraft, and coordinated convoy tactics began to tilt the balance. Donitz pulled the Wolfpacks from the North Atlantic shortly after that month. The U-boat crisis had peaked, and the Allies were finally gaining control. Campbell's ramming of U-606 was a small part of that vast struggle, yet every loss of a submarine mattered. Every rescued sailor mattered. Every convoy that made it through mattered. And Campbell's courage added one bright flame of hope in a winter of darkness. The sinking of U-606 was only one victory in a long, unforgiving war, yet every triumph mattered. 14 merchant ships from convoy 166 had been lost, but 49 others made it because 8 escorts fought 19 submarines, and because men like Commander Hirschfield were willing to make decisions that carried the weight of life and death. Campbell rescued 50 Norwegian sailors from freezing water while U-boats prowled near, by waiting for the next kill. Those rescued men lived because Campbell refused to leave them. Acts like that mattered just as much as sinking an enemy vessel. Campbell served for 46 years through war and peace across oceans and continents. After the Atlantic campaign, she escorted ships through the Mediterranean and the North Atlantic, guiding convoys through waters where submarines once lurked unseen. She never rammed another submarine, yet she no longer needed to. By late 1943, the tide of war had shifted, and Allied forces, growing stronger, each month hunted U-boats with new skill and new technology. Those submarines that once stalked the sea with confidence now faced radar-equipped aircraft escort carriers and coordinated anti-submarine groups. Campbell continued to fulfill her duties across the world. In the years after the war, she performed ocean station assignments, weather patrols, and rescue operations. Her service extended into the Korean War and later into the Vietnam War. In 1968, she deployed to Southeast Asia as part of Operation Market Time, enforcing maritime patrols along the coast of Vietnam. Even at more than 3 decades old, she steamed over 32,000 miles in the combat zone, providing protection for Allied forces and destroying or damaging more than 105 Viet Cong structures, while delivering accurate gunfire support to troops ashore. At 65 years old, Campbell remained a warship still answering the call of service. She was finally decommissioned in 1982 after nearly half a century of continuous duty. She had outlived nearly every vessel of her kind and earned her title as Queen of the Seas. Many believed she deserved to become a museum ship. Yet fate had another ending for her. In November 1984, she was towed into the Pacific Ocean around 22 degrees north and 160 degrees west for her final mission. The United States Navy used her as a target. A single harpoon missile struck her hull and Campbell remained stubborn, even then staying mostly intact as she settled slowly beneath the waves. As she sank, a final message came across the radio. "The Queen is dead. Long live the Queen." The tribute honored both the falling vessel and the new Campbell being built to carry her name and legacy. The new Campbell, a famous class cutter, designated W, Mech 909, entered service in 1988. She carries the traditions of the old cutter, including a statue of Sinbad, standing proudly in her mess deck, with a bone balanced on his nose. Her coat of arms includes a crown, a pair of seahorses, and at its center a battering ram honoring the night of February 22, 1943, when her predecessor saved a convoy by doing what no other Coast Guard cutter had ever done. Commander James Hirschfield lived until 1993, passing at the age of 90. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery as a Vice Admiral, a leader decorated with the Navy Cross and the Purple Heart. He had lived long enough to see Campbell's decommissioning, to witness her final sinking, as a target to see the new Campbell commissioned, and to watch the Coast Guard grow from a small service into a major force. Though he outlived his ship, his memories never left him. He spoke often of the ramming of U-606 of the towing journey that seemed endless, of the 73 men who stayed aboard and refused to allow their home to sink. Near the end of his life, he said he believed higher powers had guided them that night, saying they had Jesus on the bow and Moses on the stern. Whether metaphor or conviction, his words reflected the awe he still felt half a century later. How else could one explain a ship with a 15-foot hull surviving 11 days in winter seas that destroyed men within minutes? How else could anyone describe the will of 73 sailors fighting an ocean with pumps, buckets, and raw belief? Chief Steward Lewis Etheridge, who had led the all-black gun crew that fired 32 rounds at the submarine, lived until 1987. He wore his bronze star with pride and told his grandchildren about the night gun. 4 roared through the darkness, making history along the icy spine of the Atlantic. His courage and the courage of every man on that deck became part of the legacy passed down through generations of Coast Guard sailors. Today, the story of Convoy 166 and the ramming of U-606 is taught at the United States Coast Guard Academy. Cadets study Hirschfield's actions as a lesson in leadership, when time is measured in seconds and a single order can change the fate of hundreds. They analyze his decision to ram the submarine and debate whether it was brilliance or desperation or both. They look at the damage control efforts that kept the ship alive and the teamwork that held her together during the infinite hours of drifting. They learn that leadership is not the absence of fear, but the will to act in spite of it. Campbell's actions did not end the Battle of the Atlantic, yet they formed one essential thread in the vast fabric of victory. Each U-boat destroyed weakened the enemy. Each convoy saved strengthened the Allied war effort. Each sailor rescued gave meaning to the sacrifices made. When Campbell rammed U-606, she stood as a reminder that even in the darkest hours, courage still burns. Through storms, combat, flooding, and exhaustion, she refused to die. Her crew refused to yield, and the ocean, though mighty, could not overcome the spirit of those who held the battered cutter together with grit, faith, and unbreakable loyalty. Campbell lives on in memory, in tradition, and in the hearts of those who still sail under her name. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.